Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Thank you, Zubair. And on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Department of 𝗪𝗲𝗰𝗂 Pakistan, I would like to thank all of the distinguished panelists who have taken time out of their busy schedules and accepted our invitation, spared time to attend this event. We are so thankful. Regarding this title, Islam and the West, several friends pointed out that maybe this title is not accurate, and it does not accurately describes what the relationship should be. There is no dichotomy between Islam and the West. Islam is a faith for the entire globe, and West is part of it. And there is a sizable part of the Muslim world is part of the West also. There is Turkey, there is Bosnia, there is Albania, there is Cyprus. There are so many, several countries. Geographically and also demographically, because Muslims are a sizable minority in many Western countries. So maybe this title is not accurate, but we have given this title perhaps for the lack of a perfect term, or for the lack of a better term. And so this is for convenience that we have given this title, Islam and the West. Otherwise, there is a lot of Islam in the West, and there is a lot of Western culture inside the Muslim world. And there is a lot of common ground. So when we say Islam in the West, it does not mean that the relationship is always marked by hostility. There is a lot of common ground and a lot of compassion and empathy also. We have seen this in recent events in Gaza. The first reaction came from the Western world. So it was not Karachi or Cairo or Istanbul where the first reaction came from, but it came from London and Dublin and Paris and the New York. So this relationship is not always marked by hostility. We have seen this on the occasion of Muslim ban by President Trump. That so many Westerners, they came out in support of the Muslim community, and they supported the Muslim community. Many of them guarded mosques in their neighborhoods. Non-Muslims were guarding mosques in their neighborhoods. On several occasions, we have seen this empathy and compassion. So there are points of convergence, and there are points of difference. In this dialogue, we would like to understand what are the issues, and we have invited this distinguished panel for this, to understand it, how to approach it, and how to strategize it, and how to come to a structure where we can promote mutual confidence, and we can promote mutual trust. There are several questions that we will explore further, and we would like our panelists to give answers to these questions. Like, why are these two civilizations in a perpetual state of conflict with each other? Can an accommodation between Islam and the West take place for peaceful coexistence? Is there sufficient common ground within the fundamental value system of these civilizations that could possibly lead to a fruitful conclusion of this proposed dialogue? How to remove misconceptions on both sides and promote better understanding? How can the current world order become more pluralistic to accommodate genuine concerns of the Muslim world? Why is the West concerned about Islamic resurgence in Muslim countries? The last question means that if Islamic political parties come to power through a legitimate way and abiding by all the rules of democracy and all the rules of the game, why are they not accepted as a bona fide democratic player inside the system? So these are the kind of questions that we'll seek answers to with the help of our esteemed panelists. There are major concerns and issues on both sides. On the Muslim sides, the concerns are like growing anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant politics, Islamophobia, racism, and rising far-right politics in the West. Repeated display of disrespect for the Holy Quran and Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the name of freedom of expression. And this is something that we have seen. It has resulted in violence during the past few decades on both sides. In the West, it has resulted in violence, and also in the Muslim world, it has resulted in violence. And why would some people want to have it as a right to be disrespectful for symbols and for personalities that are considered sacred by a particular community? Similarly, invasions of Muslim lands, Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, occupation of Palestine and Kashmir, double standards and exploitative policies of Western countries. We have seen this in the recent crisis in Gaza, in the Western media. We have seen the double standards. We have seen the double standards in defining anti-Semitism and stretching it to the extent that nobody can genuinely criticize Israeli policies. Similarly, another concern is institutional control and Western hegemony through United Nations and IMF, World Bank, and similar institutions, supporting autocratic rulers and interfering in internal political, religious, and social affairs of the Muslim countries. So these are the concerns on part of the Muslim world. On part of the Western world, there are concerns, perceived incompatibility of Islam and Muslims with modern and Western values like democracy, freedom of expression, civil liberties, fundamental human rights, gender issues. I say perceived because in a lot of Muslim countries, the value system, they have shown that the value system is perfectly applicable to Muslim societies as well. So there is freedom of expression in many Muslim countries. There's democracy in many Muslim countries. And there are civil liberties and fundamental human rights, respect for human rights in many Muslim countries. So that's why I have seen perceived. Why are Islamic revivalist movements considered as a threat? Revivalist Islamic movements, I mean the mainstream Islamic movements like 𝗓𝗏𝗋𝗆 and Jamaat Islami, and the mainstream political parties who are genuinely participating in the democratic system. And then there are threats of terrorism perceived to be rooted in religion. Again, another concern of the Western world is influx of immigrants with totally different social and religious ethos, and growing extremism and anti-West sentiments in the Muslim world. So these are the concerns on both the sides. We have very distinguished scholars from Malaysia, from United States, from Turkey, from South Africa, from United Kingdom, from Pakistan. And there is a diversity of perspectives. We would like each speaker to speak according to their own particular experience with the West. So I welcome all the distinguished guests in this Global Dialogue for Peace initiative. This will be an ongoing initiative, and we look forward to a fruitful discussion, and we would like you to enlighten us and to suggest certain solutions to these problems. Thank you so much.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah, nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulil kareem. Thank you. I think must commend Jamaat Islami and Saif for initially contacting me and compelling me to join. This is almost midnight in Malaysia, and I think in the presence of John and Ibrahim and Anas, and Mushahid, and all friends. I mean, it's lovely to see you. Unfortunately, with all these restrictions, we are not able to travel. So it's a commendable effort. The Muslim world, to be precise, and the West. We will be discussing this for centuries. And I think 𝗪𝗏 Said has, in his response to Huntington, has encapsulated the entire debate as a clash of ignorance, actually, because you can see a lot of discussions not based on understanding and appreciation of the strength and the traditions, but so much enmity due to ignorance. So I think the effort to inculcate reason and understanding, creative thinking, is of course commendable. Now, we also have, and I think was rightly said by Asif just now, that a large number of Muslim communities in Europe, in the States, and countries, Muslim countries or Muslim societies in the West. So I think the challenge remains. Unfortunately, I get rather not tired, but having to debate the issue of Islam in the West. John, remember when I was in DC, I mean, this is one of the most popular subject, Islam and democracy, with this, some underlying assumption that there is incompatibility between Islam and democracy or Islam and the West. But unfortunately, the matter has not been somewhat resolved. I mean, Huntington is, of course, an extreme exception. But with Trump and Trumpism, you have sense, you see this obsessive revival of this anti-Islamic and Islamophobia. So that's one part which I think we should recognize. The white supremacists on the surface, and also the insidious attempt through the academia, which I think John is an expert in the subject, but he's also a victim of the efforts to undermine and attack and demonize any scholar deemed to be rather sympathetic or trying to give an objective assessment of Islam without prejudice. So although we have thought that 𝗪𝗏 Said's effort in 1971 may be, half a century old, but some of his arguments is still compelling and deemed to be relevant because of the failure to appreciate the other, which means the Muslims. Now, I would cut short on the matter of the West. Let me address, which is probably more my passion, about Muslim societies. Now, this is where, other than looking at the inherent prejudices of the West, and of course not all, I've made many friends in the West, political leaders and academicians who are reasonably objective, sympathetic, and not prejudiced against Islam. So I wouldn't approve of this overgeneralization or so-called Western attitude, although the political leadership are probably the worst of the component of this anti-Islamic demagoguery. I would like to confine now to the issue within Muslim societies. Sheikh 𝗪𝗪 𝗙𝗪, for example, talks about fiqh for Muslim minorities. Okay, but essentially in the West. But I would like to address the issue because we have to deal, firstly, the issue of legitimacy. When Muslim societies support or endorse or are governed by leadership that lacks legitimacy, it is also a major problem. Call it democracy or mushawara or shura, whatever, but legitimacy means they are accountable and they represent the conscience aspirations of the majority of their people, which is unfortunately not the case in most Muslim countries. Now, due to that, there is no democratic accountability. Ibrahim may not like me because this term is popularized by Fukuyama, but the new Fukuyama and the old Fukuyama. So, in the sense that if you represent the conscience of the majority, then you are accountable in terms of the rule of law, good governance, ridding the country of endemic corruption, grinding poverty, gross inequality. You can continue to harp against the failures or ills of the Western societies that we read much earlier in the writings of many of the earlier leaders about the rotten Oswald Spengler and pessimism. But that does not necessarily explain why we have observed the utter weakness and failures of Muslim societies. So I think as a Muslim in a Muslim majority country, I take this as a major challenge, that the internal dynamics within Muslim societies, the government or leadership that must be legitimate, that respect the rule of law, that will also understand the meaning of good governance, that rid the country of rampant corruption and grinding poverty. In a country where leaders enrich themselves, there is embarrassment of riches, clear and embarrassing. Okay, so these are issues that will by itself allow us to engage more effectively with the West. How we treat our non-Muslim minorities in Muslim countries. Malaysia, of course, is a multiracial, multi-religious country, Muslim majority. We have Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, enemies, and how we treat them would give us that moral high ground to demand respect, honor, and dignity for Muslims in the West. Gender equality, which we have been harping about a lot, but then we have an area which we are unfortunately lagging behind. No countries in this century with great pride explaining the success of because we do recognize the right of women, drivers. I mean, to me, it's a major embarrassment when basic rights like this cannot be assured or guaranteed to our own citizens. Now, having said that, we need to go beyond that because there are areas where the West has an upper hand. Digitalization, technology, economic advancement, the sophistication that is there, which we must share. So the issue of Muslim world and the West should not be seen purely in terms of juxtaposition or contradictions, but there are areas where we reassert our identity. We have our faith, We have our akhlaq and moral values, and that is not something that we can easily or need to concede, because that's our identity. That's our basic right. But at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that this engagement, this new convivencia of a sort, must happen. And Muslim societies must also look at this in a more positive sense. I know it's not easy, because the moment things are a bit settled, then you have another attack on the Gaza. And of course, this is very emotive. And you can see the debates, although I do recognize, John can correct me if I'm wrong here, that the debate within the mainstream media is something very more reassuring in that sense, because you have an opportunity or a space which was absent in the last decade. And suddenly you have a preparedness to listen to the other view. In fact, in many of these statements, shows a lot of empathy and sympathy. Now, so there is also a changing trend, but the continued impunity by Netanyahu Zionist government is of course something that would hurt the feelings of just too many Muslims, and the masses sometimes wouldn't take it in a more calculated, sophisticated, rational sense. And we have a problem there. You know, the more extreme you sound, the more radical you sound, the more popular you become. Whether it is grounded on facts or traditions of the Quran or the Hadith is a non-issue. So this is of course a major problem, because the moment you harp on gross or continue this unbridled attacks and oppression of Muslims, then you will invite a more radical reaction. And we have to grapple with this problem. I mean, I, for example, because of what I say now in a plural society, multi society, I become the liberal plural Anwar, you see, which of course then is being attacked by the more extreme ittijahat or trends within the Muslim society. But notwithstanding that, I think we have a role to play. The dialogue must continue. The engagement must be more active, more grounded, but at the same time, like the model and the character of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is uswatun hasanah. You cannot engage effectively. You cannot propound to assert a moral high ground without a showcase of character and governance in your own societies. Because of the great scholars with me, including my Guruji, John Esposito, I will end at this. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much. And by the way, Anis Ahmad was a fellow graduate student with me as well, in terms of the good old days. Let me begin with general comments, just 3 brief ones, and then I'll get to my presentation. And I would ask whoever is moderating to please let me know when my time is up. I will try to stay within a 15-minute period, but you know, feel free to just cut in and let me know. Western powers need to rethink and reassess their policies domestically and internationally towards mainstream Muslims. I will refer to this later on in terms of attitudes with regard to the support of authoritarian regimes, and certainly issues with regard to Islamophobia, or more recently, when we look at the situation in Israel and Palestine. I certainly think that the Biden administration, I have great respect for President Biden, but the Biden administration's amidst all the good policies he has, the policy thus far with regard to the Middle East is wanting. Both he and the Secretary of State seem to not really, in the statements that they make, look at the realities of what is happening. The idea that the United States would therefore have a Secretary of State who would not be speaking directly to the leader of Hamas, but rather be speaking to the president of the authority, who actually lost the vote to Hamas many years ago, is really very disturbing. There was a report today, which I cannot completely verify, but it was in The Guardian, which mentioned that 550 Biden staff people basically issued a statement which indicated in many ways that they would like to see a more balanced approach. We seem to still be starting with Israel and rather than seeing this as an even playing field. And so, for example, one constantly, even in Times media, will say that Hamas is firing missiles as if that's what started the whole thing, rather than looking at what happened in East Jerusalem, the police basically going into 𝗪𝗲, the attempt to in the 𝗪𝗲 area to seize properties, and then the back and forth. But it acts as if every time Hamas is simply sending missiles without saying that, in fact, what's also happening every time Israel is bombing indiscriminately, as the international community has noted. With regard to Muslim governments that rely upon authoritarian rule, and sadly there are and continue to be too many of them, and rely on their security forces rather than elections and repression, well, they'll have to open up their political systems if we're really going to move forward. That is, if the region is going to move forward, but also if Muslim-West relations move forward. They will have to open up their systems, build and strengthen civil society. In many contexts, there is not a strong civil society. Discriminate between free speech and mainstream opposition, and violent extremism, on the other hand, that must be crushed and contained. But societies that limit freedom of thought and expression produce a sense of alienation and powerlessness that often results in radicalization and extremism. Let me move to my comments with regard to Islamophobia. And this is a project that I've spent a lot of my life on. And I would just say to those that are watching, there's lots of information if you go to bridge.georgetown.edu, bridge.georgetown.edu. We have about 1.1 million followers on that site, and you'll find all kinds of factual information, reports every day, etc. Muslims are integrated into many European countries successfully, into others not so successfully. And even in those countries where they're integrated and integrated well, such as the United States, the UK, Germany, France, they have to face the realities of Islamophobia. In some cases, more recently, as I'll discuss, it's not only an anti-Muslim attitude coming from the far right, but also from, for example, Mr. Macron in France. So we see growing anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant politics and racism, and the rise of the far right occurring in the West. Islamophobia has grown incrementally, influenced by the Iranian Revolution, 9/11, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and their violence and terror in the Muslim world and globally. Major polling reports began to note as early as 2015 that Islamophobia had become normalized. That is, major polling by Media Tenor and others looking at mass media, social media, saw that it had become normalized, and normalized in media, normalized in politics. The far right, but also increasingly mainstream political parties and politics, as I will be talking about with regard to France, Austria, and Germany. And in mass and especially social media, and sadly, among some religious leaders. Baroness Ворсі of the UK's House of Lords commented a number of years ago that Islamophobia had become acceptable dinner conversation. And more recently, she's been critical of the UK Conservative Party for not addressing Islamophobia within its ranks. The US has seen most recently in Donald Trump's presidency a major problem with regard to officially the US and dealing with both Muslims domestically and internationally. As a candidate, President Trump, as a candidate, said Islam hates us. And when pressed on it, said, well, there are many of them. There are many of them. But he stuck to that phrase, Islam hates us. And then, as you know, instituted a Muslim ban. And many members of his administration, including Secretary of State Pompeo, have a long track record in being, in terms of their statements, and also being associated with groups like Act for America, which is a very vibrant anti-Muslim organization. In America, for example, we have found, and it also exists and is influential in Europe, an organized and well-funded Islamophobic international network. For example, in the US, CARE and the University of California at Berkeley Center, in their 2016 report, Confronting Fear, noted that between 2008 and 2013, $205,838 went to Islamophobic writers, Islamophobic organizations, and social media. And there's a kind of cross-pollination and international connections, which you can see, for example, when you look at the Norwegian and New Zealand terrorists, and they're citing American and other European Islamophobes and their writings. Islamophobia today, to just look at 3 examples, major politicians in France, Austria, and Germany have framed political Islam, Islamist separatism, or they've used the phrase Islamism as the greatest threat to European society, calling it a poison that has to be extinguished. This phrase political Islam is used in general more recently by these governments, and they don't make the distinction between political Islam, talking about mainstream involvement of Islamic political parties and organizations. That would be part of political Islam, but rather political Islam is simply a negative thing. If Muslims are framed as carriers of a poison, every measure can be taken as an antidote to protect oneself. This attitude allows political leaders to justify drastic political measures against an allegedly dangerous group of people, but often it's actually Muslim civil society that's being impacted. Thus, we have seen police and security raids against Muslim civil society, mosque organizations, and scholars in France, Austria, and Germany in the name of protecting the state and its constitution. However, the result is that values such as freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech and thought, enshrined in their constitutions, are undermined. The net result of this xenophobic, anti-Muslim, and anti-immigrant far-right extremism, which we see, can be seen in the rhetoric, policies, and significant election performance of far-right political parties across Europe. Mr. Macron, who is not part of the far-right, but is leaning into their very position as he looks to future elections in order to broaden his base of support. In France, in response to the brutal murder of a secondary school teacher by a Chechen immigrant, French Interior Minister called for swift government measures against the enemy within, referring to France's Muslim community. Under the banner of protecting the state from Islamic terrorism, French authorities launched a crackdown, not just on extremists and terrorists, but also on the country's near 6 million Muslims. The government carried out raids targeting Muslim civil society, marking 231 people for deportation, arresting dozens of others, and classifying more than 50 Muslim associations for dissolution. One of the organizations French authorities identified for dissolution is an NGO, the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, an advocacy organization that documents hate crimes against Muslims. The organization had noted rising anti-Muslim sentiment in France and found that in 2019, there were nearly 800 anti-Muslim acts, a 77% increase. Yet France's interior minister, with no proof, called the organization an enemy of the Republic. Macron has campaigned for his policy of Islamist separatism, talking about that, but often again defining it but not defining it clearly, and in application, brushstroking mainstream Muslims as a law and order issue, claiming that government measures were needed to fight against political Islam. The French and Austrian governments, like far-right Islamophobic writers and organizations, frame critical scholarship and polls and facts as responsible for creating and promoting a dangerous social divide. Islamophobia is portrayed as a combative term, a weapon. Frame the discussion against Islamophobia as a weapon used to silence criticism of Islam and Muslims. They charge that anti-Islamophobe, anti-racists have in fact become racist themselves and call for defending the state against the erosion of their Western values. The Islamophobic discourse is also used by other European governments and politicians to silence criticism of their assimilationist policies, or lack of, and policies towards immigrants and working class Muslim populations. In Austria, we've seen an attack against Muslim civil society, similar to Macron's policy to crack down on Muslim civil society. On November 11th, 2020, 930 Austrian police stormed 60 homes throughout Austria, in Austria's largest police raid operation since 1945. The most recent examples of the dangerous results and fallout from this culture war is the raid against these alleged terrorists that took place, as I said, on November 20th. They argued that the raid had aimed at cutting off the roots of political Islam. When the defendants accused of a terrorist organization and terrorism finance were interrogated following the raids, they were asked questions that had little to do with violence and militancy, but a lot to do with an Orientalist perspective on Islam, being Muslim and having political views. They asked the following questions. What do you understand by the term Islamophobia? In your opinion, is this term justified? If so, please explain why. And what do you understand by the term? Are Muslims suppressed in Austria? Is Islamist global terrorism possibly the reason for fears emanating from Islam? Or is it the oppression, especially of women or people of other faiths, by the norms of the Sharia? Do you wake up your wife for prayer in the morning? Are your kids allowed to play music? Do you have non-Muslim friends? Is your daughter allowed to marry a Christian, Jew, or atheist? Despite these allegations, not a single person has been indicted. Yet the problem is that under Austrian law, these people are still, for the next 2 or 3 years, at any point, the government could indict them. In the meantime, they have frozen their bank accounts, affected their jobs, etc. I'm going to skip Germany because of time. The West and its conventional framework and policies is the next topic I'd like to address. The challenge for American and European policymakers remains to replace the conventional framework that relies on heavily supported authoritarian regimes, their military, their security forces, to ensure stability through security. We saw this in the ambivalent approach to the Arab Spring, and then accepting what happened with the elections in Egypt, but then later accepting the coup and what's happened subsequently in terms of foreign aid, etc. We need to move beyond the past and current policy that equates protection of Western national interests with the stability and security of authoritarian regimes. Policy driven more by fear of the unknown, often particularly of Islamic movements and parties, or called political Islam, is a process whose outcome one cannot control. And it tends to undermine principles of self-determination, democracy, and human rights. Major polling by Gallup and other organizations show that a policy of uncritical support, while attractive to authoritarian allies and their entrenched elites, feeds anti-Americanism in particular, but also anti-European allies like the UK and France, and fears of Western intervention, invasion, occupation, and dependency. There's a need for a new narrative that goes beyond a Cold War approach and the policy of democratic exceptionalism, as even President George W. Bush acknowledged that the US under presidents, including in his first term, and he wanted to correct this, he said, practiced a policy of democratic exceptionalism in the Middle East. I referred to the failure of the Arab Spring, and we can discuss that down the line. I'll just end with a couple of comments. Western governments need to think about changing their approach as well as the way that they've moved forward. The US and Europe should work with and use diplomacy, their political, economic, and military leverage to pressure Muslim authoritarian allies, to work with them in the, but also to pressure them to broaden political participation. In some places, it doesn't exist at all. Develop independent government institutions and strong civil societies that limit corruption and increase respect for human rights. Western governments provide substantial aid for economic and educational development very often. They need to cut back, on the other hand, on substantially on arms sales and such high-profile symbols as oversized embassies, military bases, ships, and troops, all of which emphasize American and European armed presence and the tangible threat of dependency, intervention, and domination. If authoritarian Muslim governments and societies are to change through evolution, not revolution, rulers must become more accountable to their people and governments, more independent and pragmatic in their relations with the West. They reflect better the interests, desires, and values of their people. And let me end with this. Greater democratization will not need necessarily to lead to wholesale secularization. The idea of modernization and secularization theory that modern states had to be democratic and adapt Western models of development is exaggerated. Today, there are many of us who talk about multiple modernities. There can be a synthesis of greater freedom and the recognition of religious values included within societies. And I hope in the question and answer period, we'll get into Israel and Palestine. I'm going to end there because I think I'm overstaying my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, my dear brother, and to everyone, assalamu alaikum, peace be with you all. It's a pleasure being on this panel. I congratulate the 𝗪𝗆ة الإسلامية and the Global Dialogue for Peace, this brilliant initiative for which I pray its success. And I think that the topic that we're touching on today is one that is extremely important from a number of perspectives. And I think that the issue that we're all trying to touch upon today is where have we gone wrong? What is it that has led humanity at the very pinnacle of its technological, cultural, intellectual advancements, led them to become so at loggerheads on so many levels? Why is it that when we look at the world today, a world that we inherited, and this, if we wish, civilization has been in place now for 200 years, probably even more, some would argue, from the French Revolution onward, from the time of Enlightenment. Why is it that we are facing the crisis at the levels that we are seeing today? And it is true that on many, many levels, we could talk about the crisis that we face and which are existential. We're not merely talking about an economic crisis or a social or a political or or a strategic or a security crisis. We're talking about crises that are on an existential level that actually threaten the very place in which we all survive and exist, the world itself. Let's not forget, of course, our focus is about people and their welfare, but let's not forget that people, live in a very damaged environment, and the fight to save the climate and save the world and try to reverse the kind of damage that we've inflicted upon our home, our collective home, is something that we as strategists and intellectuals and the such seldom touch upon. But it's going to be something that will mark the struggles and the conflicts and the fights of the coming 20, 30 years. But let's go back a little bit and try to touch on what we're addressing today. When we talk about a civilization, and we've all known, and many here have written very eloquently about civilizations and civilizational aspects and issues and the such, and what makes a civilization, what breaks a civilization. And we've all studied how former civilizations have risen and prospered for a while and then fallen and crumbled and dissipated. The main characteristic that all civilizations are built upon is their ability, their inherent ability to promote and to advance a set of values. And those set of values not only marked intellectually or culturally, but actually practiced and promoted and perpetuated throughout the societies where this civilization stands. And I think that for a good while, the main values that we all agree upon, but from a practical point of view, were there. I think that they marked to a large degree, the entities that we're talking about today, Western civilization and culture, as well as Islam and the Muslim world, at varying degrees, in varying locations, probably in different moments of time. But in essence, it was those values that created the kind of strength within the Muslim world, as well as within the West, generally speaking. And it was very much the going against those very values that marked the downturn and the spiraling out of control of at least the Muslim civilization. But now we're witnessing the beginning of that downturn here in the West. And for reasons that have been already mentioned by Dr. Siri Anwar Ibrahim, as well as Professor John Esposito, and I'm pretty sure we'll hear from Professor Yassin Aqtai, as well as Dr. Ibrahim Rasool. It's, of course, I mean, we talk about the elements of conflict today, and most notably the recent conflict between the attacks of the Israelis on the Palestinian people, and the failure of the world to keep Israel at check. But in my view, this, as momentous as it is, and as expansive and important as it is merely a symptom of a greater illness. And that illness is our failure as human beings, whether we be in the West or whether we be Muslims or whoever we be, to actually abide by the very values that our civilizations perpetuate and propagated. And I think that hence lies many of the problems that we face today, whether they be political, whether they be economic, whether they be security, on industrial, on every single level. The problem that we face today, and I'll talk from my perspective here in the West, we are facing a crisis, and that crisis is existential. And I'm talking about a crisis from within, as well as that crisis in dealing with the other, or actually designating who the other is and how we should deal with that other. Within the West, or the Western civilization, if you wish, the past year has been telling. The past year has been extremely telling. The impact of COVID-19 on every single aspect of life, which put to the test the very extremities of the brilliance and technological and medical and laboratory advancements that we have achieved, and which, you know, we hold proud over all of humanity, was tested to the degree that I think that we would merely pass, or probably even be deemed to have failed. The fact that we were clueless as societies, with all the advancements and all the brilliance that we held, and all the the sources that we had, actually we failed, to the extent that it was only for what we would term, very probably passingly and very passively as authoritarian, draconian measures to be implemented, that we kept control. This was only controlled by extreme measures of control of the public, and rightly so, of course. But what I mean is that when the most advanced amongst us, those who hold the bastion of this civilization, when they fail to the degree that they did, that brings into question the whole premise upon which this civilization sits. The fact that there were, in many sessions that I attended, amongst which were some very high placed think tanks and study and research centers, including Chatham House, for instance, when people, throw about the question, is democracy and the kind of model that we build our civilization upon, is it more apt to dealing with crises such as this, or probably a little bit more authoritarianism would do us good? The fact that all China had to do was that the premier say something and everyone just stood in line, whilst here, because of democracy, because of freedom, there were so many layers to go through in order to bring to an end, for instance, school days. Questions like this that bring us to question the very basis of our being and who we are and our identities is extremely telling. The fact that so many people died under our watch, in our watch, brings into question the fact that how safe can one be as we perform these days? Once again, I go back to the main issue, the issue of the value system that we uphold, the value system that we promote, the value system which we defend to the death, that we fight for, that it becomes worth waging wars in order to defend. That value system is crumbling. We talk about freedoms, and there can be no question that when, where I sit, the space of freedoms and the expanse of freedoms that I enjoy are incomparable when looking upon places like Syria or Egypt or Iraq or Libya or the such. That goes beyond question. But that's not how the degree of my freedom is measured. I was told, my civilization told me, that freedom was an essential element within its being, and that goes from the private to the public. As we stand today, freedoms are being curtailed on a systematic, regular, consistent basis, and there is absolutely no space to fight them back. The spaces of expression are being contested. My dear brother mentions about marching up and down the streets of London and bringing cities to a halt on issues which we regard as being righteous. And by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we managed to bring out 150 and then 200,000 people to London in order to protest against the Israeli crimes. But that took a lot of effort, because now our parliament, London, the bastion of democracy, passed a law which actually restricts public protest to the level whereby you have to jump through hoops in order to hold a protest. And that happened under our watch. The economic disparity that is going to be the mark of the next decade at least, because of the impact of the year and a half that we've all been through. This economic disparity is so vast and so obscene that it's difficult to quantify. We share on WhatsApp groups or on emails, we share the image that 1% own as much as 75% of the human population own. And we say it flippantly, but if we give it some thought, it's absolutely obscene. And it's a mark of how the civilization that we're holding on to is definitely on the downturn, unless there is an emergency recovery to allow some sort of equilibrium in our existence as human beings. John mentioned the issue of democracy, of freedoms. Our strongest friends and allies around the world are some of the most dictatorial, authoritarian regimes there are. And that's a mark of who we are. It's good. It's not good enough saying that I'm a democratic country and all my systems are run democratically, when I could so passively and so quite credulously actually stand by and watch as other fledgling democracies are crushed, as we did here in Europe, throughout the world, in the case of Egypt and in the case of so many places where democracy was about to be built once again after a century of deprivation from all freedoms and liberties. The issue of equality, of equity, the issue of there are so many issues that I believe are merely symptoms, as big as they are, as critical as they are, but they are merely symptoms of the essential issue upon which we can avoid a civilizational clash, or we can actually perpetuate one. And that is the issue of our values. What are our values? What are our values? Are those values aspects for which we are willing to live and die, to fight and to create peace, and also to ensure that others live by, develop, and enhance? This is no zero-sum game. Some imagine that the rise of a particular civilization must be upon the ruins of another that has just crumbled. It's not like that anymore. We don't live in the same times as the Roman Empire or the Chinese civilization of old. These are different times. And we need to make absolutely sure and certain that the values that we live by, and by the way, these are values that aren't restricted to a geographical place nor a historical time frame. These are values which most sane and rational human beings, regardless of their faith, regardless of their creed, of their ethnicity, of the tongue that they speak, agree upon. And therefore, we already have shared values which various people around the world agree upon. And therefore, we have the basis to create a truly great and tremendous civilization. However, if those values are used as commercial issues that are to be monetized, to gain greater authority and control, to restrict and to probably even enslave others, and to create gaps of conflict and disparity, then our civilization, our own house, becomes under great threat. I look forward to hearing from everyone and then to taking part in the discussion. I would urge that this first session is built upon by follow-up sessions, because the details of this and the issues of, whether they be political or economic or cultural, are so vast that they need a new set of ideas and a new way of thinking in order to address and to hopefully then resolve. Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. As-salatu was-salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers, it is very, very big pleasure to be with these honorable guests and with this community like 𝗪𝗆, John Esposito, Anas Al-Tikriti, Anwar Ibrahim, and Shahid Hussein, and Asif Luqman Ghazi, and Khurshid Ahmed also. And I would like to say you all assalamu alaikum. And thank you for inviting me to such a good event. And but I want to start with questioning the very simple question. Of course, somebody have mentioned about this, about the comparison between all these dichomatization, the West and the East, or the West and Islam. I think, of course, everybody knows it's very simple, reminding only about Islam should not be equated with the East. Of course, Islam is a religion and East is a sort of geographical, probably visual geographical naming or conceptualizing. And that's undoubtedly the West should not put as an alternative to Islam. And Islam, because there are many reasons, of course, for this, but there are too many, first in respect of too many Western Muslims. There are many communities in the West now, many Muslim communities in the West who are by Western origins, and also the Balkans, for example, are Muslims, and they are in the West, and in some sort in this relative meaning of the term. The Western, the Balkanian people, and there are many people in Spain. Spain for many years, for centuries, for 7 centuries, was located by the Muslims indeed. And not only about the immigrants or the diaspora, or Muslim diaspora in the West, but also there are many native Muslims in the West. That is one reason, of course, but another reason of historically and epistemologically, Islam and the West cannot be separated from each other, because that is in the Western civilization and in the epistemological basis or the origins of the Western civilizations, there you can find many strong roots, strong Islamic roots from Islamic philosophy, which transformed these are very simple reminding, of course, not to make you busy with this, not to occupy that's just to remind about this, of course. And also, of course, Islam is a world religion like Christianity. It is not a local. It is not to be identified with the East. Islam is not equal with the East. Islam is the religion. The claim of Islam is to be universalistic. It is like Christianity. I cannot separate these. I cannot discriminate Islam or Christianity in that respect, because Islam is not part of the East. Of course, it is Eastern, it is Western, it is Northern, it is Southern, and it is in one word, it is a universal. And after that reminding, I would like to remind another word by Rudyard Kipling, who said that the comparison should be made probably with the East and the West, but it is not the issue. Now when we talk about Islam and the West, we know what we mean, of course. And we remember that Rudyard Kipling was saying that East is the East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. From another, coming to more historical or more concrete aspect of this discussion, of course, there is, I try to make reference to my sociological background and some sociological theory, symbolic interactionism. That is, it is a rule of symbolic interactionism in this sociological theory, which suppose that we understand each other, even we perceive each other according to our prejudices, according to something we have experienced, and there are some rules for this theory, which suppose that humans act toward things on the basis of the meanings they ascribe to those things. And we see the Western acts, or the Muslim acts to the West, or to the Western act to the Muslims, according to on the basis of the meanings they ascribe. The Muslims are ascribed to West, or the West is ascribing to things. Of course, this is coming out of a very strong media covering or media propaganda, which is prevailing our world, and which is covering the name Islam, unfortunately, which is influencing how the West is perceiving Islam, of course. And of course, this is not, of course, the end. After that, it comes the next rule, which is saying that the meaning of such things is derived from or arises out of the social interaction that one has with others and the society. We should remember about what action has taken place during this the last century, and in the last century we can see, of course, the collapse of the Ottoman society. Just for your mention about my being as the hero Ottoman generation, and also in the Ottoman, the collapse of or the defeat of the Ottoman state by the Western countries, of course. Afterward we can see a sort of absence of the Muslim representation, Muslim political representation in the world. We cannot see a sort of Muslim mode. Muslim mode is in a sort of diaspora within their own land. I mean, all Muslims are in their land without any political representation, without any organization, any political organization to represent themselves or to fulfill their own requirements, life requirements on behalf of these Muslim communities. This is very important, very important problem. Of course, that is what is experienced on the side of the Muslims, of course. But on the other side of the Muslims, of course, the Muslim world has been collapsed. There is no problem about the Muslim world because there is no more Ottoman society, there is no more caliphate, there is no more political unity which is representing the Muslims, and so there is no danger in one sense. But after, and that is why probably Israel was built. After this, it was very easily, it made possible the establishment or the foundation of the state of Israel in the heart of the Muslim world, in the heart of the Middle East, in the heart of the on the reminders of the Muslim world, unfortunately, and which is being of course favored, whatever it acts, whatever it did, it was tolerated, and a sort of new double standards of all values or things has taken place. From the Muslim world, from the Muslim side, of course, there is a sort of lack of or loss of memory and loss of the unity of the integrity of their world. And the meanings, and the third one about this symbolic interaction as in is coming, that the meanings are handled in and modified through an interpretive. Sorry, the meanings are handled in and modified through an interpretive process used by the person in dealing with the things he or she encounters. And what we are encountering during our world, that there is a meeting, of course. There is interactionism. In all interactionism, there are two parts, at least two parts, of course. There is a pluralization of many parts, of the fragmentation of the parts. Neither the West or neither the European part is united, or is one word or one color or one form, and nor the Muslim part is one form, one color, one part. Of course, there are many Muslims. There are many sort of Muslims. There are many sort of Western words. Of course, this is a dialogic process. Fortunately, of course, in the world of globalization, as much as the globalization is gone on, there are many channels are being opened for new dialogues, for new interactions, for new interactionism also, and so now we have, I can say, we have many new opportunities, new chances, new channels to set new dialogues between us. But again, we have the problem, of course. The West is concerned about Islamic resurgence, and that is not a secret, of course, because in one sense, I like to always refer to Lacanian metaphor about how the ghost of Islam is coming out. The ghost of, because it was being killed, just as Nietzsche has said that God is dead. And now the Islam was that. Islam had been killed in the First World War. How it came to be a ghost, a sort of ghost, and come out to a sort of resurgence. It is something fearing, of course. And I think I can identify the fundamental fear with the fundamentalism, the fear of fundamentalism, or the fear with some Islamophobic terms, because it was fear. It was being killed, and there should be no more fear or threat or challenge of Islam. But now Islam is resurging, and this resurging, unfortunately, because of this interactionist rule, is prevailing, and this fear is coming out now. Understanding each other is, in one way, a hermeneutical problem, of course. In this way, the Western countries are concerned about Islamic resurgence in the Muslim countries. Unfortunately, they are not happy when the Islamic, even when it comes in the way of democracy. And unfortunately, much more than this, when it comes through democracy, it is fearing much more than it comes from in the way, for example, like some Islamic terrorists, etc. Because some Islamic terrorists are making more comfortable, because they are keeping you in your comfortable area, because the Islamic terrorism is the usual things. It is what it should be. The Islam is terrorism, and Islamic terrorism is not surprising us. But when it comes through democracy, because for many years, as Mr. Ibrahim and Anwar Ibrahim mentioned, there we have witnessed and we have encountered with the question, is Islam and democracy compatible? That question was really very boring now, and now is more and more boring, and is very hypocritical now, after what we encountering, what we experienced during the Arab Spring, and before the Arab Spring, even before when Hamas won the elections, for example. It won the elections. It was democracy, but they said, oh, because Hamas is not democratic, and that democracy cannot be accounted, that cannot be respected, and they rejected the results of that democracy. And then in the Arab Spring also, it was a champion. It was a sort of victory of democracy in one sense, but because it also opened the way for the Muslims, or for the Islamic resurgence, for the coming of a sort of, indeed, what we witnessed was a sort of the development or the emergence or the improvement of the Islamic democracy, Islamic democratic parties, like the Christian democratic parties. We cannot find no more difference between them. But because we saw very clear hesitation in the Western part, unfortunately, even in Europe or from the American side, and we saw very strong hesitation about how should they treat these, although should they stand with these democracies, and they didn't stand with these democracies, especially when they encountered the counter-revolution process, the coup d'etats happened. We saw any solidarity with the Muslim democracy from the Western side, but still we are witnessing, and we are still continuing to hear the very boring and very upsetting the question: is Islam and democracy compatible? Yes, Islam and compatible. There is no problem with Islam and compatible. But it looks that there is problem with the problem is coming with especially the democratic Islam is more fearing, I think, as far as you know, because democratic Islam is relying on the will of the people, the popular will, and the popular will in the Muslim world, of course, should stay with Islam, with some Islamic values, of course. But that is not making happy. That is not making happy some politicians. Not to say of all politicians, as I said. I don't want to make any generalization and not to go in any way in in the track of essentialism. Of course, there are some politicians, very good politicians. Of course, not so good politicians or bad politicians. Evaluation is also very naive. Of course, I don't want to say this, of course, But this is important, I think, to mention about the stand of the Western politicians with some Arab autocracies, of course. As much as now we witnessed, I mean, that is my impression after some symbolic interactionism with some Western politicians, that the Western politicians are more likely to work with or to be in solidarity with Arab or autocratic regimes rather than the democratic Muslim or democratic, even Arabic. They don't like democracy in our world, of course. And of course, from Turkish point of view, Turkey is another, is very close. It is the neighbor of the West. It is in the border of the West. And it is so, Turkey is now, and even when you look at the history now, the European parts who are considered as the European part geographically were part of Ottoman states just 100 years ago. And all the Balkans, or even some part of Hungary, Austria, or Budin, or many countries, Albania, were part of, even the Greece, the Bulgaria, all were part of the Ottoman society, part of the Islam. But now we saw all they are now Christians, just because there were no compulsion in Islam, and Islam didn't impose upon them, or the Muslim government, the Muslim authorities, political authorities didn't impose upon them to be Muslims, and they didn't force them to convert. And it is indeed that is very unusual in compared or looking at the history of the imperial states. And and the witness, the real witness, is the Balkanian now. It is the Greece, it is the Bulgaria. They were part of, they were in the heart of the Muslim world, but they didn't be coerced or be forced to be Muslims, and now they are keeping their way. And now we are seeing Turkey is trying to be a member of European Union, as you say. There is no problem with being part of Europe, being part of we are considering ourselves as Turkish people, as Turkish country is considering itself as part of Europe and part of the West. And there was no problem, and still there is no problem. I think the problem is still the problem of dialogue, problem of understanding each other, problem of symbolic interactionism. But what we see is, of course, everybody is witnessing the rise of Islamophobia, the rise of political rights or the right-wing radical rights in some Western countries, especially in France, in Holland, in Dutch, and in Germany. And so we see, unfortunately, the rise of these radical right-wing parties is because of a reaction against the a Muslim country. The Islamophobia is starting to be reflected, or to be articulated with a sort of Turkophobia, or even Erdogan phobia. And now Erdogan, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is now the object of fear. And those who are not saying that we are against Islam, they are saying we are against Erdogan. But Erdogan is the result, is the consequence of democracy, is the consequence, very natural consequence of Islamic democracy in any Muslim world. Of course, what we saw, the reason for Islamophobic reactions are not Muslims, of course, in anywhere, because it has much to do with the media covering Islam. And all victims of the so-called Islamic terrorism are the Muslims, indeed. When you compare and when you go in detail, when you go in the reality, you can say all the victims are Muslims, indeed. There are very little number, very small number from the Western sides are victims of. But just on the contrary, all the active actors of the terrorism, the coordinators of the terrorism, those who are arming these terrorists are Western countries indeed. And those who are making plan, they are who manipulating the Daesh or coming from abroad to invade Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and all these are coming from some Western countries, and they are because of their preference to work with some autocratic regimes, and because of their preference to come and to design all these sites, not to leave it on their own situation, on their own will, and they try to interfere to their own internal issues, and they are trying and afterward, of course, the terrorism, what we call the terrorism issue is arising, and this terrorism indeed is not have nothing to do, of course, with Islam. But unfortunately, what we saw is this. I don't know whether I think I exceeded my time.
I think so,
if
Dr.
you say
Yassin.
stop, I will stop.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here in this company of really distinguished guests. I just can't tell you how much I appreciate each one of them, and how I had a great chance to learn from each one of them. So I'm the student of all of your guests, and now they can evaluate me. So I'm already trembling and thinking how I'm going to perform. But I have one essential question that I will pose to a whole panel, and I'm speaking now as a Muslim from the West. And so this dichotomy that we have presented here, Islam and the West, for me creates a kind of real difficult situation, because I'm in the West. I feel that I'm part of the West, and I feel very much at home here in the United States of America. However, I also have a small problem with distinguished guest, our Dr. 𝗚𝗃𝗍. I don't necessarily think that Ottoman legacy is just his. Ottoman legacy is mine as much as it's his, because I come from the Balkans, and as he knows, the Balkans gave to Ottoman Empire, particularly toward the end of it, like a third of the elites were coming from the Balkans, and maybe even Mr. 𝗚𝗃𝗍 have some Balkan roots himself. So, Islamic history and Islamic civilization is shared by all of us. And this is the problem kind of embedded into our discussion today. Also, we have to, how would you say, we have to clarify what is the level of discussion or level of analysis, as we will say in academia. Dr. Esposito was touching upon it, and he was addressing various issues from that approach. And I very much appreciate that, because we have to understand Muslims are all over the world, over 1 billion of people, and we have different issues in different places. But if I'm to summarize the problem here, I'm going to essentially touch upon the discussion that Brother Anas had. And to me, the real problem between the West and Muslims in general, or Islamic civilization in general, coming from my focus on studies of nationalism and studies of religion, which one is a form of universalism, while another one is the form of particularism. And another one, as being the form of particularism, produced the world system that we have. So the main issue that we have, that I see, is how to find a proper balance between individual well-being, individual pursuit of happiness and fulfillment, and the group well-being and group, how you say, happiness and fulfillment. And this is what Brother Anas spoke about, I think, when he asked the question, what are the values that we want to defend? And I'm not the only one talking about the problem that we have to find a proper balance between individual and group rights, or individual well-being and happiness, and group well-being and happiness. Western world now is encountering that problem big time, how to balance essentially things between the group rights and group well-beings, including Muslim groups in the West, and how to essentially continue emphasizing the individual rights and individual selfish pursuit of happiness. And so same way Muslims have that problem as well. We have to reevaluate the value of individual, whether that individual is woman, and notably today there's no woman in the panel, which kind of is a problem. I will post that as a criticism, right? Or it is any other Muslim, good or bad, or it is even a non-Muslim. How do we, bring back the value of individual that Islam teaches us, that individual, it's all about essentially, individual and individual salvation. So that balance is essentially at stake. And so that's why, perhaps maybe also because like Anas, I'm in the West and I see that from the Western side, and I see that essentially we are approaching the same problem, but from different directions. And another issue which kind of stems throughout all these discussions, starting with distinguished Mr. Ibrahim and our great leader Aqtai, is the issue of Muslims are no longer in a position to accept humiliation. We are a new generation of people. As he said, this is boring. I don't want to even discuss anymore this issue of, democracy, incompatibility with West and all that stuff. I am a Western as much as anyone else. And to me, I see absolutely no problem with my lifestyle and my fulfillment here. So I want to be treated with respect. I insist on being treated with respect, and I will provide the respect to anyone else. We do know that Western, political hegemonic powers are not used to that. They're not used to talking to a Turkish leader and saying and looking eye to eye to him. They are maybe used to different kind of realities, but things have changed. Zero sum. We do, as Muslims, theologically don't believe in zero sum, and we are accepting, a possibility to, create a lot of common ground where we can share this world in a mutually beneficial way. So we do not necessarily think and agree that somebody has to be above and the other one has to be under. We think that we can be equal in every sense of the word, truly equal at the opportunity, not necessarily equal at the outcome, but truly equal at the opportunity. And, we have to find a solution together. Why? Because we are facing serious problems coming our way as a world globally. One of them is I'm super worried about climate change. And I think if we don't find a ways to talk to each other in a mutually respectable way, I think we're all going to be in a serious problem. So my question for all of the panelists is, I would love you to, if you can, elaborate on this kind of problem of balance between individual fulfillment and group fulfillment. We Muslims emphasize group fulfillment so far, but maybe how can we revisit this issue and understand, or reevaluate the value of individual within Muslim world. And there is nobody who asked a question about this Western world, so I can only propose the question for us. Thank you.
Jazakumullah khair. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil mursaleen, Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina wa Maulana Muhammadin sallallahu alaihi wasallam. My dear respected panelists, all of the people who are watching, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Good evening, good morning if you are in Malaysia, good afternoon if you're in the US. This is an enormously important conference that I think we are engaging in. And I really want to thank the 𝗪𝗪𝗪 Pakistan. They have led us at the moments when Islam was being denigrated by colonialism, and they now lead us again in navigating our way to a better relationship with those who have been our adversaries. I do not deal with the West as a geographical concept, but I deal with it as a philosophical concept. A philosophical concept that gave us colonialism. When it came to Africa, it enslaved Africans. When it went to Asia, it developed this notion that 𝗪𝗪 𝗙ص calls Orientalism. And now that it encounters the Muslim world, it gives us a new set of concepts that is based on what John Esposito so eloquently describes as Islamophobia. It has bequeathed to us the nation state that is only governable by authoritarianism. It has given us a situation in which the anger that was generated by colonialism and became extremism has suddenly become the war on terror. And so we need to understand the West as a philosophical construct if we are going to diffuse the binary inherent in the idea of Islam and the West, and if we are going to diffuse the aggression that has built up between these entities. And as we have learned in South Africa, the initiative to diffuse and reconcile irreconcilables and make peace with history and conflict that comes in that history is often not the prerogative of the aggressor or the perpetrator. It is often the prerogative of those who have been the victims. And tonight, I think we gather as victims of that Western philosophical construct to lead to a new reality, a new relationship with the West. I want to say that this is not outside of the gene pool of Islam and Muslims, that we have a legacy that comes from the early time under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, in which he has laid the template for the way in which we are able to navigate this path to a new relationship with that philosophical construct called the West. It has been one of my most fortuitous encounters with the Quran when I suddenly understood this notion in Quranic revelation of breaking news in Surah Rum that starts with the words 𝗪𝗪 𝗪𝗪, that the Roman Empire has been defeated. It came in real time, and it came to ring in a way in which Islam and the early Muslims would respond to the superpowers of their time. When the Persian Empire, polytheist, and the Roman Empire, Christian, fought each other to a standstill. And out of this conflict, the Quran in Surah Rum tells us, soon the Romans will be victorious again, and on that day shall the believers rejoice. That is 7 years before the Hijrah. 2 years after the Hijrah, indeed, not only does Rome prevail in its battle with the Persian Empire, but in that same year, the Quraysh sends an army to Badr, and they get defeated by a much smaller force led by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, I've grappled with what's the importance of this politically for our world today? Why is that 9 years so important? Why is the promise of Allah that soon will the believers rejoice? It is because under the leadership of the Prophet, the 9 years created what in political terms is called an interregnum, a pause in history, a transitional moment in history. And it's how you use an interregnum that is absolutely crucial, because what the early Muslims did was to occupy 5 important spaces, strategic spaces in that interregnum. And I put this to you with a view to understanding, is this the same kind of interregnum that we face in the world today, a world beset by crises, existential crises, as has been mentioned. Because what the early Muslims did in Mecca, faced with repression and torture and murder and boycotts, they learned strategic patience, resilience. They then used that to take out a strategic insurance by sending Ja'far and a few other Muslims to Africa, to Abyssinia, just in case they don't come out of the encounter well. The third one that they did was to explore strategic alliances in Taif, where they were rebutted. But in Yathrib, with Aus and Khazraj, they are able to succeed. When the time is right, the alliances are made, the repression gets very heavy, they do a strategic hijrah, a retreat to Madinat al-Munawwara. And once there, the Prophet ﷺ strategically consolidates not just the Muslims, but the entire community of Medina under the Charter of Medina, and establishes the city-state that is there. So the question that we must ask is, are we similarly besieged as Muslims today? I think certainly, intellectually and theologically, we may be facing some inertia. We are not going backwards necessarily, but we are also not going forwards. Secondly, what we have is challenges from within our own ranks. People, Muslims, who hijack the religion for the purposes of extremism and dominate the public perception of what Islam and Muslims are about. The third one is that governance is not by the democracy of Anwar Ibrahim or the ability to navigate rights like 𝗚𝗪𝗏, but by the authoritarians within the Muslim community. What we have is Islamophobia that is rampant. We are an object more to be feared than to be embraced. And so we are besieged. But the question is, if we are going to turn siege into opportunity, is the West undergoing an interregnum? I think after 30 continuous years of war, the United States public is war weary. Its fiscus is depleted. It doesn't have the kind of money for adventures. We actually have to say, slow down your exit from Afghanistan and don't create a political vacuum. Its internal strife, Black Lives Matter, its inability to reconcile its component parts across Europe and North America is creating an internal sense of strife, and its public is restless and wants a new reality, wants to be out of the financial crisis, the environmental crisis, the human crisis under which those communities are besieged. And so what we have is the possibility of that moment of interregnum in which new realities can be conceived. And therefore, as Maulana Maududi have taught us, the Quran's wisdom is, Inna Allah la yughayyiru ma biqawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim. Allah will not change our condition until we also change that which is within ourselves. Not sequentially, not the one, then the other, but in parallel, together. And so we need to ask in this moment, how do we do that double movement? How do we create an internal coherence amongst ourselves? How do we not give permission to the opponents of Islam to do unto some Muslims what we do, such as Shia, such as Sufi, such as the exclusion of women, whether in society or maybe even on a panel like this? How do we make sure that we don't give permission for our intra-Muslim strife to others to make it an inter-community strife? At the same time, how do we reach the strategic outreach that we must be able to do? I'm reminded that before Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was Rasulullah, before he was the messenger of Allah, he was Al-Amin, the trustworthy. He spent many years perfecting the winning of trust before society was ready to accept the message. We may be hasty in wanting to give a message where there is not the basis of trust yet. And so how do we build the basis of trust where our gender relations are sorted out, where we are not sectarian amongst ourselves, when we demonstrate how we can confer rights on each other and on others? Whatever the difference is, how can we demonstrate that we are not afraid of difference, but we embrace difference so that it indeed becomes a mercy? So unless we show that, we don't win trust and we don't overturn fears. And so we need to be able to understand how do we approach this. At the same time, we must also demand the consistency that we demand of ourselves. We must demand of the others. You cannot continue if you are in Washington or London or Paris. You cannot continue to give the Muslim world the triple bypass, a bypass of democracy, a bypass of human rights, and a bypass of freedom just because you don't like Mohammed Morsi. You allow a coup d'etat. And so we must demand that consistency that we put to ourselves. We must put it in our interactions with the West as a philosophical construct. We've got to be able, as we move forward, to understand that Allah does not forbid us from having relationships with the others. In fact, the two conditions for relationships with the others is تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر. It is to cooperate for the good and to prevent what is bad. Those are the two conditions under which this dialogue must be able to happen. The bad that we must prevent is this multiple crises that's assailing the world today. The good that we must do is for good human relations, for equality, anti-poverty, for sustainable living, and for mutual coexistence. The alternative is mutually assured destruction. And so every resource that is within the Ummah, within the global Muslim community, must be put at the service of averting destruction and enjoying the good by acting on the immediate crises that are there. And we hold a significant set of keys towards that. And we must be assertive that the Islamic civilization is so deeply enriched that we can make this contribution if we are not stereotyped, if there's no generalization about us, if there is no brushing with one comb, and if there is no attempt to destroy who we are in our identities and how we live and our religion. I remember Nelson Mandela on the eve of negotiations with his enemies who jailed him for 27 years. He comes out and he says, our enemy is not a people, it is a system. And that is why our enemies are not Westerners. They are the West as a philosophical construct that bequeathed the world the kind of danger of colonialism, of enslavement, of Orientalism, and all of those. Those are the concepts that we have to unpick and push back. Nelson Mandela also taught us that when you deal with those who are against you, isolate only the most extreme, but embrace as much of the middle ground as you can. This task that we are busy with is a task that deals with a scalpel, not with a broadsword. That's what extremists do. They wield a broadsword and cut everyone who's different. We need to say, who are the populist, right-wing, evangelical extremists that drive this rhetoric of Islamophobia, that drive this war on terror, that drives the demonization of Muslims? How do we use the scalpel to separate them and win the trust of the mainstream? That is why we are seeing on the streets of London, the streets of New York, a new generation coming out and saying, we are not beholden to the enemies that you had in order to keep the state of Israel in existence. We are beholden to human rights, to respect for human dignity. And therefore, what we need to understand is which of those in the Western hemisphere of the world, which of those do we enter into tactical short-term partnerships for good, to prevent bad? Who are those that we share objectives with so that we can enter into strategic coalitions with them? We may not agree on everything, but we agree on a few fundamental values that is the basis for cooperation. And then we must ask, who in the world do we have certain principled agreements with, and that we can enter into long-term principled alliances with? So often we want to raise our objections against Christians because of theological differences on Tawheed, and miss out that we have a common ancestor called Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salatu wassalam, who should be the basis of forbidding the wrong and enjoining the good. And so I think, and I'm coming to the end, what I think we need to be able to do is to turn away from the hard power that extremists have come to make us known for, the ability to have terror, the ability to have fear, and shift onto Islam's preferred terrain called soft power. The fountainhead of our soft power is Tawheed, integration and unity. We may not convince everyone of La ilaha illallah, that there is no God except Allah, but we may convince them kana nasu ummatukum ummatan wahida, that humankind is a single community, and build on that. The lodestar of our soft power is justice, a sword that cuts all ways. It cuts against others, but it also cuts internally to those amongst us who are unjust. If we show that our justice knows no barriers, even against ourselves, we convince the world that we are principled allies for justice, where the glue that holds humanity together is mercy, rahmah, and that we show that mercy to others as we expect mercy to be shown to us, that our civilization excels when there is peace, that salam is our way forward, that wasatiyah, being in the middle, is our anchor, not on the extremes, that knowledge is our foundation, and that we are here to recover the lost property of the believers. Because without al-Khwarizmi, there would be no fourth industrial revolution. Without the canons of medicine, there would not be the intricate ways in which all procedures become possible. Without everything else, there would not be space exploration. And so, my respected brothers and sisters, our relationship with the West needs to proceed from trust. Trust must be built on both introspection and outrospection. And most importantly, it must be premised on us being the purveyors of the soft power of Islam, because then we are at our persuasive best. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Thank you very much. This initiative has indeed laid the foundations for creating safe spaces for meaningful dialogue. It has been an amazing panel, a perfect model of peaceful coexistence or how it should look like. And I truly hope that GDP or global, this initiative, it is going to host more of these programs, and we are going to have these mentors train more people like themselves, people who can hold on to their own ground without pulling others down, people whose academic honesty and integrity allow for them to present the most forthright critiques while maintaining an objective lens. So my first question to Professor John Esposito, and I'm quoting a portion or an extract from his interview. And we have already decided that we're going to move beyond boundaries of Islam and the West, or any other boundaries that may exist in our minds. And he has said in another interview that historically speaking, tribes, ethnicities, and national identities have been defined in terms of the other, or more accurately, over and against the other, relying on stereotyping. So I would like to request the professor to expand on this statement in the context of today's topic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I mean, I think that our last speaker, Ibrahim, really touched on this very well. We're at a point in history where, on the one hand, from my point of view, I thought when I finished my degree, before most of you were born, that surely there would be these great strides. There would be, freedom in Palestine. Muslim-Christian relations would be constantly moving forward. Muslim integration into Europe, Muslim countries would be moving forward. And in fact, we're really called to look to a new age, and some have referred to that. We have new generations. If you look at the, the response to the situation in Palestine and Israel, if you look at the response to the Muslim ban, as someone said, you have a cross-section of people responding. And we need to do that because we're in a world where, just to bottom line it, we have a rise of the far right across the US and Europe. Okay, in countries that don't have Muslims, you have or very few Muslims, you have a high rate of Islamophobia. That raises questions. We see governments in the Middle East, they haven't gone forward, they've gone backwards, as far as I'm concerned. Gulf states that have the wealth to really, and seems to me, have developed educational classes, etc., have in fact very often become more entrenched, fearing what the Arab Spring looked like it might bring, which would be a call for greater political participation, etc., but also a division within the Middle East itself between some of the Gulf states and Iran. I think that the real way forward has to be where we have people who both, in terms of their religious worldview, and here I think, again, Ibrahim Rasool did an excellent job in laying that out, but also people of other faiths are able to step forward, because if this doesn't happen, then we'll have the problem that we have in India. India is supposed to be a secular democracy, and it wants to be a Hindu nation. We'll have the problem we have in Israel. Israel didn't just want its independence, but Netanyahu has it declaring that it is primarily a religious state for Jews and first-class citizenship, and others do not have that citizenship. So I think we have a real challenge ahead of us. I think those of us that have the opportunity to write and speak and etc. Really need to be thinking about not just our being out there with paradigms, but also the engagement with younger generations. And I think that's going to be really where we're at. I mean, I think you do see, for example, the 150,000 people who marched, in London, etc., and that cross section. That's out there, and I think there are plenty of people who generally they tend to be younger generations that want to move forward. And I think that critical mass has to really be developed.
Thank you very much. Okay, my next question is to Sir Anwar Ibrahim, and I would also like him to give some closing comments at the end of the question. That you have been leading a multi-ethnic and multi-religious society for decades and in an inclusive manner. Malaysia is a very good example of that. So what are the lessons to learn from that for other Muslim societies?
Do claim to have this capacity to then set as an example, but we are trying to navigate a very difficult, uncharted waters somewhat, because it is also a problem within the Muslim society who thought that Muslims must remain intact, defining their own religion and race. But after more than 2 decades, we have had some experience now. What is the advantage? The advantage is this is a forum, a continuous forum to discuss issues. For example, the understanding of Islam by non-Muslims. Every issue, when you talk about Sharia, when you talk about Hamas, when you talk about Palestine, it has to be discussed. It's an ongoing thing throughout the year. To me, that's an advantage. You talk about dialogue, it is not something that is seasonal. It has to be discussed on a weekly basis because issues crop up. At the same time, we are compelled to try and appreciate and understand the views of the Christians and the Hindus and the Buddhists. That is why in Malaysia, we promoted this idea of conferences like Islam and Confucianism. So there is that advantage, to my mind, to set the parameters, the principles right. Okay, we talk about rahmatan lil alamin, but sometimes when it comes to trying to engage, it is not as simple. So I think I'm very, very optimistic. Yes, we still have problems to get people to appreciate, but what are the fundamental issues? It's still, to my mind, in political realm, the issue of legitimacy, issue of accountability, of good governance, of rule of law. I mean, so we try to set these parameters right so that there is an appreciation for the ethics and values. To me, Islam to be promoted must be an issue of character, ethics, and values. We cannot be talking about Islamic governance and if corruption is rampant and gross injustice, whether to the Muslim majority or the minority. Issue like poverty or grinding poverty for relatively vibrant economy like Malaysia, totally unacceptable. And this is an area which everybody would agree. But this does not mean that contentious issues like the application of the Sharia, the issue of our position vis-a-vis the faith and character and Muslim etiquette or dress code, which is of course peculiar to the Muslims, but it must be well understood with a measure of tolerance. I know it is difficult because I come generally from my early experience basically with this predominantly it's a Muslim organization. So now you have to interact, navigate within this more complex mechanism, but I think it has to be done. Muslims are about close to 60% or a bit less. So we have to deal with the 40% non-Muslims, and in some provinces, non-Muslims are in the majority. So to just dismiss this and to say that they are quite irrelevant, it is not feasible, not tenable for a country, because the paramount concern is peace and security, but the essence is still justice. But having said that, the inculcation of Islamic values, the issue of faith, the issue of akhlaq to the Muslims is of course a separate exercise that must be well comprehended and understood. which means we have to be more vigorous, aggressive, or effective in our da'wah to the Muslims, to enhance their understanding and to ensure that they live up to the expectations as a Muslim. Then, of course, there'll be a contentious debate when it comes to the political side, but still, we have to navigate it carefully. I think in my limited experience in Malaysia, I get great satisfaction because, say, when it comes to the issue of Palestine or issue of even Muslim minorities or issue of the application of the Sharia, if it's well understood, it has to be debated, and we educate ourselves, but we engage. But to conclude, I must say, we must also reflect our attempt to understand. I remember when I was involved with Islamic University, I said, whilst we want the West to understand Islam, there must be also an effort on our part to show that we are as concerned, as committed to enhance our own understanding about the others. Otherwise, we become the reverse of Huntington. Huntington will condemn Muslims as the potential danger, and we take that sub-position. So at the philosophical construct that Ibrahim seems to talk about, I think there must be this attempt to understand. When I say this, at times I have this short, limited problem because people tend to think that we tend to or give less importance to the issue of Islamic ethics and value. It's not true. What I'm saying here in terms of context multiracial society, but in terms of the Islamic awareness, either directly through our party mechanisms or through organizations like ABIM, the Da'wah organizations, there are positive efforts to enhance the understanding and to live up to the expectations as a Muslim. Shukran, I must...
Shukran jazilan, thank you very much.
Yeah, because it's now past almost 1:30 a.m. So I'm now struggling now.
Thank you very much. Okay, my next question is directed towards Mr. Anas Al-Takriti, and it's about perceptions, and we've just talked about soft power and perception management. So in Western societies, masses are confronted with a predominantly negative image of Islam, and the same is true vice versa in the East, where masses are fed negative images of the West. What role can media play in improving these perceptions? What positive role can media play? And what measures may be taken towards a globalized, pluralistic society and future?
I think we're at a very advantageous point in our history, in our lifetimes. I think that we've managed today to thrash out the majority of issues that we've all confronted in our respective careers, whether it be political or diplomatic or academic or popular, such as my own work, working with the grassroots and the such. But to be perfectly honest, I think that if we've learned anything from the recent Israeli aggression against Jerusalem and Gaza, is that one of the things I've just written an article about is why is it that the vast majority of mainstream media seem to have shifted on some levels quite significantly, on others not so, but still quite markedly from the old positions of pro-Israel, whatever may come, for the first time. And I'm pretty sure that John will agree with me that we see speeches in Congress and in the House of Representatives like we've never ever imagined possible. I recall in one of my earlier visits to the US 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when highlighting this issue, someone giving me a word of advice saying, listen, don't ever mention anything bad about Israel, because that you'll be kicked out of the room regardless of what you say afterwards. And now all of a sudden we have senator after senator coming up and raising the issue of the Palestinians and what they're suffering. And we're talking now about occupation. When you have a headline in the Washington Post talking about apartheid, no less, or about racism within the Israeli state and system. This is something where we're seeing a shift. And one of the reasons why this shift is happening is the fact that we are now in the throes of a totally new generation. From one side, a generation that doesn't have the very same emotional, historical linkages to what the Jews suffered at the hands of Europeans during the 20th century. They weren't there, they didn't witness it. Now stories have become a little bit more distant, and they see the world according to the world they were brought up in, according to a value system that I spoke about. They see Israel as, well, it shouldn't have any kind of exclusive standing amongst the international community. Why should it? On the other hand, we have also a generation of Palestinians, as well as Arabs and Muslims generally, who aren't carrying the baggage of failed states, of the failed and corrupt revolutions that run our lives for so long. They weren't witnesses to the intikasa, to the 67 war, to the Abdel Nasser time, to the Ba'athists, to the such. They're also now in a new reality, and they are basically those two sides. They're now talking to each other one way or another through the miracle that is social media that we're seeing today. And therefore, we're seeing a totally different set of dynamics. Now, politics is not the same as I grew up understanding or even teaching. And I'm pretty sure that we can all see how things are changing and shifting, including the issue of perception. As virtually everyone spoke quite rightly, that in the past 20, 30 years, we have been so obsessed about the Islam and terrorism, women, extremism, whatever it is, other faiths. It became, you can't now think that it's possible to be invited to a session that has one of its title, any of this. There's a shift, there's a change. Now, in terms of the importance of the media, this is something that, to be perfectly honest, I think we shouldn't claim exclusivity to. The problem of the media is a universal problem. We have, and I'm talking here about the mainstream media. Social media is a different entity, and it needs its experts to comment on. But the mainstream media is actually at a point of crisis, just like everything else that I talked about. The fact of the matter is that we don't have anymore those, long-standing, really credible, neutral, impartial forms of media or channels of media that we can consume their outtake on the news and with any level of confidence. I grew up when the BBC was the sort of model of how a media platform should behave. I don't think that anyone can say that anymore. Unfortunately, today, media has been commercialized just like anything else. And it's the owners who often tell their editors, what kind of line to tread. And this is something that I believe is, once again, and I've said the word crisis so many times today, but it is a crisis, not only for the media per se, but for democracy. Because democracy essentially relies on, why is it that I have an equal vote like someone who's never been to school before? Why is it that someone who's served in government for probably 20, 30 years has exactly the same vote as someone who's probably never ever heard of a political party? Why is that? It's because the assumption that everyone has the opportunity to access the pool of knowledge equally. So that access is granted and the pool is unpolluted. So once the pool becomes polluted and the access becomes restricted, you have a crisis on the level of democracy and how it works. The entire system becomes failing. So it's something that I believe is a challenge for each and every one of us. I believe I'm quite optimistic. This might come as a surprise to anyone who's heard, my presentation as well as this. I'm quite optimistic because I do think that one of the problems that we suffered over the course of the past 20, 30 years was the kind of being bottlenecked. We were strangulated. We had nowhere else to go. The options were very restricted. Even when talking to various political parties in the Arab and Muslim world, their options were either none or maybe one or two options. We had nowhere else to go. Now we are proving, and probably since the Arab Spring onwards, the whole world, and not just Arabs, not just Muslims, but the entire world is proving that it is providing more and more access points and more options for those who seek real change. People are talking to each other. People are corresponding and exchanging ideas. They are saying, we want to be better. And that's something which I think is what academics, politicians, and diplomats should absolutely espouse and promote.
Thank you very much. My next question is addressed to Mr. Yasin Akhter, and we've discussed fault lines and flashpoints. I would just like you to discuss some way forward, identify a starting point for building a narrative of peaceful coexistence that we could take away.
Thank you. Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yes, I would like to request you to identify the way forward, starting with some starting point from where we can build narratives of peaceful coexistence. From today, we are moving beyond binaries, we are moving beyond divide, we are understanding the flashpoints and the fault lines, and we want to grow as one homogeneous global community in peace. So what is the first step towards attaining that peace in your eyes?
I think I am not that much optimistic about what will happen in the next, because unfortunately this globalization it was supposed to be, because of the possibilities of the globalization, was to make us more close to each other, to interaction, to a good relationship, very, very dense relationship with each other, and it will help us more understanding each other. But unfortunately, in all the coexistence or the metropolitan coexistence in the cities or in the places, in the spaces where we meet each other, is not making us happy with each other. Just on the contrary, it may make us more far away from each other. That is one. I think we can, for example, make recommendation for each other, but who will listen to us? I mean, of course, people are being influenced not only by the people who are very, 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 very positive, who are carrying out very positive values, or some peaceful values, etc. Because people, unfortunately, the world is under the influence of very racist and very ethnocentric and very megalomanian ideologies, and this is the problem. And unfortunately, the politicians who are influencing the masses are not trying to influence them on the basis of some very good positive values. Just on the contrary, they are trying to invest in their populistic some bad values, and the bad values are being considered as very good and very interested. They are being interested in these bad values, and they are investing in this. But anyway, that is not to be very to keep in this pessimistic way. Of course, as you know, for example, in the world, the most important and most strong sources of Islamophobia is not the West. I'd like to say this. Unfortunately, the most important source of Islamophobia is some Muslim worlds. For example, some countries who are, for example, the Emirates or some other countries, Islamic countries, unfortunately, in order to criminalize their oppositions, their opponents, political oppositions, they are producing some Islamophobic ideas and Islamophobic discourses. For example, you know, just as I mentioned, the Erdogan phobia, there are some sort of political Islamophobia or Islamic political phobia of this sort, for example, or 𝗚𝗃𝗏 phobia is one of the most important. I mean, source of making or producing Islamophobia. For example, in some countries, some Muslim countries are not are criminalized their own Muslim opposition, and they are identifying them with terrorism. We know saying that it is Islamic terrorism. It is not, for example, it is very difficult to say to make to hostile or to attack Islam. But if you say, or if you put besides its terrorism, that is Islamic terrorism. The Islamic terrorism, there is nothing to do. Islam has nothing to do with terrorism. So what remains is Islam itself, and the objects of this attack remains Islam only. And this is, I think, one of the most important reasons that the Islamophobia is being abused by these Muslim politicians or some Muslim governance in the Muslim countries, unfortunately. And but of course, the share of the West in this, the Western countries or the Western ideas in this, of course, they are investing in these autocrat regimes, and they are not unhappy about this, and they are also they are sharing this guilty with them. Anyway, we will try to produce our aspirations or ideas, and in order to make it more understandable.
Thank you very much. There have been some difficult questions asked in the chat box. I'll come to them later, and in the Q&A also. They are related to Turkey as well, related to 𝗚𝗎𝗍, related to the problems within the Muslim world, and they have not been deliberately sidelined. It's just the time constraint for which I have not really addressed them one by one. Okay, coming to Mr. Ibrahim Rasool. I'd just like to quote from Martin Luther King that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So whilst we may aspire for global peace, it is not possible without addressing the fault lines and the flashpoints. So your closing remarks, sir, please.
No, thank you very much. I think that sums up whatever one could be saying. And that is why I'm saying that the engagement with the West is not a one-way engagement. It is not the engagement of the weak. It is, in fact, where those who have been victimized historically take responsibility for the humanization of the perpetrator, like Nelson Mandela did with apartheid South Africa. It is not an unconditional one. It is one that says that the truth must prevail. It is also one in which we must be able to say that that we've got to understand the relationship between soft power and hard power. I see the soft power of Islam as the default position. You cannot have a religion called Islam derived from peace and be warlike all the time. You cannot have the first attribute of Allah being Ar-Rahman and then portray Allah as a harsh tyrant. You cannot have the mission of Rasulullah bin Rahmatul lil Alameen, a mercy unto all, and we are harsh to anyone who differs with us. You cannot have the Ummah described as Ummatan Wasatan, and then we allow extremes to foment within us. And so that is the default position, but Islam and Muslims always understand the need for hard power. We are not pacifists. We are essentially soft power people, and that is why when it was called upon Muslims, together with other Black South Africans, to fight apartheid, we gave our share of martyrs, we gave our share of heroism, we went to jails. But it is not an unguided missile that we deploy on the world, because then we become counterproductive to the very essence of what it means to be Muslim and what Islam stands for today. They must know that we are uncompromising on injustice, but they must know that we are by nature a people who seeks peace, cooperation, coexistence, and integration with the world. And so I'm not presenting you, when I speak about soft power, I'm not presenting you with a pacifist approach to the world. I'm not saying turn the other cheek. What I am saying is be strategic all the time, because that is what the Prophet ﷺ taught us at the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. He was not being weak at Hudaybiyah. He was being absolutely strong because he had a vision of how he wanted to enter Makkah. He had a vision of what his ultimate objective was. The problem with extremists and those who are emotional is that they have no vision for the future beyond their immediate anger. Anger must be cooled down. That's why I say Ali radiallahu anh teaches us on the battlefield, he's about to kill someone and the man spits in his face. And instead of killing that person, he withdraws his sword and the man says, you're a fool. And he says, no, had I killed you before you spat in my face, I would have done it for Allah. After you spat in my face, I did it out of personal hurt. Now, what is Iman? What is taqwa? If not that absolute awareness of your relationship with Allah and your relationship with your feelings. And so maybe that's the best way for me to end. I share the optimism that Anas Al-Tikriti shares. We have been in the battlefield for long. We have seen worse. We know that it can be better because in Surah Rum, Allah's promise is true. وَيَوْمَئِذِ يَفْرَحُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. On that day will the believers rejoice. But we must do the hard work. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move back to Mr. Asif Luqman Qazi, who's the host for today's session. And there have been comments about not talking about Kashmiris. I'm sure he's going to address that in his closing remarks. And from this forum, I'd just like to say that we condemn injustice everywhere. So be it in Kashmir or with the Rohingya people or in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, in Bangladesh, in Egypt, or anywhere in the world wherever there is injustice, this forum, which is the Global Dialogue for Peace, this condemns that injustice. And we stand with the people who are oppressed. Thank you very much. Closing remarks from Mr. Asif Luqman Qazi, please.
Thank you so much. I will not add further remarks because we have already passed our time limit. And I was just to show solidarity with the person who joined us from the farthest east, 𝗪𝗏𝗪 𝗪𝗏𝗪. But I think he has already left us, but we kept him awake for quite long. It's I think quarter to 2 o'clock in Malaysia. So thank you so much, all the distinguished panelists. Thank you so much, Professor John Esposito, Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, Dr. Yassin Akhtai, Dr. Anas Al-Tikriti, and 𝗪𝗏𝗪 Anwar Ibrahim for giving us time out of your schedule. We certainly hope that your patronage will be available to us in our next events. We acknowledge that Dr. Ghulam Nabi Fai has remained with us from Washington, and we would like to hear from him about Kashmir issue in some next program, inshallah. But we certainly want to acknowledge him that he has remained with us. Thank you so much, everyone, and God bless you. Good night, good morning, good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.